Streicher?
Streicher.
Okay.
Julius. Julius.
Okay, he was in the second group of the cliques.
Well, he was actually, his rank was, Streicher's rank was that of Gauleiter. Now, I have to explain, we didn't even know how these things worked until we interrogated them. In the Soviet army, every military unit and government had a commissar. The commissar was the political element of the military and also of the government. So every government, every state in Germany, like Bavaria, that's a state, Franken, that's a state, Westphalia is a state, Württemberg is a state. So every state was also known politically as a Gau, G-A-U. And a Gauleiter was the political head of that state. Now, he also had a governor, but the governor really was not as official, as important as the Gauleiter, because the Gauleiter had access to Führer. He was appointed by the Führer. A governor of a state could be elected, but you know, they even gave up the elections. So the Gauleiter was really like a governor, powerful. He had the power of life and death. He could sentence somebody to say, okay. Under the Gauleiter, there were other Gruppenleiters and Gruppenführer, broken down to the Blockleiter. Individual city block had a Blockleiter, whose job was to gather information, a spy for the government. Communists had the same thing. Nazis had the same thing. If you listen to BBC, the radio, that was verboten. That was not allowed in Germany. But the Blockleiter, nobody knew who he was. He could be your husband, could be your father, could be your wife, your son. The Blockleiter was to squeal on people who violated Nazi law. If they listened to the radio, if they criticized the government, criticized Hitler, spoke out against him, the Gestapo would come knocking on the door at night and haul them off to a concentration camp. That's what the Blockleiter's job was. Well, the Gauleiter is the guy who appointed the Blockleiter. The Gauleiter was appointed by Hitler, and then he would appoint the people down the line. So you divide it into states, region, and then areas, and all the way down to a block in the city. So a Gauleiter is pretty high up the ladder. Well, Streicher, in addition to being the Gauleiter, of course, was the editor of this Stürmer library. And it was pornographic against the Jews. Dirty jokes, dirty cartoons and pictures, and stories about Jews, most of which he gathered from his collection called the Stürmer Bibliothek, the Stürmer Library, made up of publications, documents, books written by the Jews, for the Jews, about the Jews. He collected these from all over Germany and all over the occupied countries. And then he would take these articles and distort them and make the Jews the bad guys in his anti-Semitic articles to stir up racial hatred. It was propaganda. It was the kind of racist, anti-Semitic thing for which the Nazis were famous. And he, of course, established the philosophy of anti-Semitism, which was the basis of Nazism. Streicher was one of this Nazi element. He was a partner of Hitler's before Hitler came to power. He was known as the Alte Kämpfer, the old fighters who helped Hitler come to power politically way back in 1921, 22. And the putsch in Munich in 1923, where a lot of these people were part of that element. Okay, who are some of the others? Hans Frank, the butcher of Poland. He was the governor general of occupied Poland after the Germans invaded Poland. Frank was called the butcher of Poland, but he was the governor general who sent thousands to the extermination camps like Auschwitz, Birkenau, Sobibor. These were the extermination camps in Austria and in Poland, which of course gave Nazism its really bad name. And Hans Frank, the butcher of Poland, who admitted that he had sent more than 2.5 million Jews to concentration camps. Another was Baldur von Schirach, the Hitler Youth leader. He was in charge of the Hitler Youth. A boy or girl from age 9 on had to belong to 9 to 11 was known as a pimp. Those were the little boys. You might compare them only in age and organization to the Cub Scouts or the Boy Scouts, the pimp. Then from 12 on, a boy would belong, actually almost 14, would belong to the Hitler Jugend, the Hitler Youth. The girls would belong to the Bund Deutsche Mädels, BDM, Bund Deutsche Mädels, the equivalent to the Girl Scouts in age. After service in the Hitler Youth, a boy would, at the age of 18, go into the Reichsarbeitsdienst, that's the labor service, and he would spend 1 or 2 years in a uniformed labor service, working in the woods, building roads, doing labor on farms. The young women that same age would go out and do service, public service, in hospitals, on farms, and get special training in motherhood. Learn how to cook, become a housewife. No such thing as a career woman in Nazi Germany. After serving 1 or 2 years in the Reichsarbeitsdienst, both men and women would then become eligible for the armed service. They would then go into the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, or the Army, or the Navy, military service. For every healthy young man.
Mandatory?
And for women too.
It's mandatory?
But
mandatory for everyone to be in the military?
Right. When it went into the Corps. And then in the Army, of course, they would receive special training, which would be of great service to them after their military service. Because they, just like our Army, you learn something, you become a specialist, and that serves you in good stead when you go out of the Army. Communications or whatnot. All right, back to this clique of Nazis. I mentioned Hans Frank, Julius Streicher, Robert Lai, the Labor Front leader. The Labor Front, I said, is the government union that everybody had to belong to. You couldn't get a job in Germany if you didn't belong to the Labor Front, the Reichsarbeitsfront. That was Lai. Fritz Sauckel. Sauckel was the man in charge of slave labor. Non-Germans being forced to come into Germany as displaced persons. Poles, Czechs, French, Belgians, Luxembourgers, Dutch, were brought into Germany to work in industry, in the mines, under Albert Speer. 5 million of them were forced into German labor. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, who betrayed Austria and later became the military governor of the Netherlands. In that same group was Wilhelm Frick, Minister of the Interior, who was responsible for establishing and enforcing the anti-Semitic laws, like the Nuremberg laws, 1935. In that same category were, let's see, some of the others I can think of. Kaltenbrunner, who was in charge of the SS and the Gestapo under Himmler. He was in charge of all the concentration camp guards and also the Sicherheitsdienst, the SS and the Secret Service. Kaltenbrunner was the successor to the hangman Heydrich. Heydrich was assassinated in Czechoslovakia. In response to that assassination,
would you like me to bring you some hot water?
These people, the Nazi, we refer them as the Nazi criminal element, second category, the clique. They stuck pretty much together. They wanted nothing to do with the generals, whom they blamed for losing the war. The generals wanted nothing to do with the Nazis, whom they blamed for the atrocities and the concentration camp, of which the generals claimed they did not approve. Now, in the third category, we had the bureaucrats, the statesmen, men like von Papen, Admiral Horthy, the Regent of Hungary, Selte, who was a commissar, who was in the political organization of the government, Minister of Labor, the Minister of Communications, the government officials who ran the German government. They weren't the political animals that the Nazis were, but they ran the government. I mean, everything except the police. But they ran the Department of Agriculture, the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Labor. Streicher didn't belong to that category, but we had the Lord Mayor of Stuttgart. We had the man who was in charge of, well, everyone who worked for the government, a bureaucrat. Some of them had worked in the Weimar Republic. Some of them had even worked in the German government under the Kaiser. When the Weimar Republic was established, they changed their political affiliation and held on to their government jobs. When Hitler came to power, they joined the Nazi Party and became government officials under the Nazis. So they were political opportunists. They took care of the government and changed their political affiliation to fit into whoever was the head of the government. It was von Hindenburg during the Weimar Republic. It became Hitler under the Nazi regime. It was the Kaiser before that, the time of World War I. But they were also important because they served Hitler's government. If Stalin had come riding unter den Linden, they'd have jumped onto the communist bandwagon. They would have been communists and held on to their jobs. So they were in the third group. Now, you asked a question earlier about Himmler committing suicide by taking poison. So did Goebbels. Goebbels committed suicide. Hitler committed suicide. you could tell how important a Nazi was by whether or not he had a capsule of potassium cyanide when he was taken prisoner. Himmler did. He was taken prisoner at Flensburg in Germany. They put him in a room devoid of furniture. They stripped him of all his clothing. He was naked. They left him alone, and 15 seconds later, he was dead. He had a capsule of potassium cyanide in a hollow tooth, which they didn't find when they searched him. Goebbels, of course, committed suicide before the end of the war. And so did Himmler on April 30th, 1945. Others whom we took prisoner then, or even whom surrendered, quite a few of them had the capsule of cyanide. And we confiscated them, of course, when they were all searched at the time they were taken prisoner, or even if they voluntarily surrendered. The only one who succeeded on poisoning himself was Goering, 1 hour before he was to be hanged. And that, of course, is a story that we'll come to later on. The question of how did he get the cyanide with which he took his life? Why didn't we catch him? Why didn't we detect it? And we'll get into that a little bit later when we get to Nuremberg. Now, our job then was to interrogate these prisoners at Luxembourg. Nobody in the world, with very few exceptions, knew about Mundorf, Ashcan, and today I do a lot of public speaking still. I always ask my audience, how many of you knew where the Nazi prisoners were between May 1945 and September 1945, the 3 months? Well, everybody speculated. People thought, well, Goering was probably in South America. People would even say, I just came back from Rio de Janeiro and I saw Goering driving a taxi. People have said, I come back from Buenos Aires and I saw Hitler operating an elevator. You could always get your name in the paper by claiming to have seen a Nazi leader in South America during the summer of 1945. Well, they were all in Luxembourg. Those who had surrendered to the Russians, to the French, to the British, and of course to the Americans, whom we took prisoner, they were all brought to Luxembourg, Ashcan, the Palace Hotel in this little resort town. Some of them had surrendered voluntarily, others had disguised themselves and were discovered when we moved into a town that was liberated all throughout Germany and Bavaria, where most of them were taken prisoner by the Americans. 86 of them were now in Mundorf. Out of the 86 then, we interrogated. Quite a few we didn't even bother to interrogate. They weren't important. They happened to be at the wrong time at the wrong place, like the military aides to Goering, to Streicher, not to Streicher, he was not a military man, but to Keitel and to Jodl. These were general officers, and they had aides, military aides, and valets. They unfortunately were taken prisoner at the same time their bosses were. So they weren't of any value from a military intelligence standpoint. They just happened to be in Mundorf until we decided who was important and who wasn't, then we sent them home. And as a result of this interrogation, on August 12th, all of the interrogation reports and the analyses that we made of the prisoners, when all of that material was screened, on August 12, 1945, the War Crimes Commission decided which 22 were to be tried at the first session of the tribunal in Nuremberg. And those 22 were then transported to Nuremberg and established in what we called the war criminals wing of the prison. The other prisoners, if they were still of any use, based on what we learned about them, were also brought to Nuremberg, but they became witnesses for the prosecution. Some of them volunteered to give us information, and they appeared in the course of the trials as witnesses. Others we kept as prisoners to become witnesses for the defense. People who were not in the decision-making category, but who executed some of the decisions that were made. They could either work for the prosecution or the defense, depending on their degree of fanaticism or their degree of pro-Nazism. So they also came to Nuremberg, and they were in a witness wing. I'm thinking, for instance, Franz Xavier Schwartz, who was the Nazi Party treasurer. He was a kind old guy, over 75 years old, 77. He was totally in the dark about any of this. He really didn't know. He joined the Nazi Party. He became the Nazi Party treasurer. He became kind of a front man, not a vicious anti-Semitic type. He didn't know anything about that. A man in his 70s who we thought was important because he was a Nazi Party treasurer, but he merely collected dues, 50 pennies, 50 pfennigs a month, collected dues for the Nazi Party. He didn't handle the big finances. That was done by Goebbels and Himmler and that clique who were close to Hitler. Schwartz, his son was also a prisoner of ours, but only because he was president of the National Brewers, the breweries in Germany. So those guys became sources of information, not at all important, but they became witnesses in the course of the trials. But that wasn't determined until we completed our interrogation in Nuremberg. Now, when all of this business ended, we decided that the prisoners would be moved to Nuremberg or to Oberursel, Germany. Oberursel had a camp where we interrogated prisoners who were not necessarily war criminals, who weren't to be treated that way. Or maybe they would be tried later on in the denazification trials that took place. In Oberursel, Germany, we had what we called the DIC, not the DIC, but the Military Intelligence Service Center, MISC, Military Intelligence Service Center. We took a DULAG. A DULAG is an acronym for Durchgangslager. A Durchgangslager, a DULAG, was a processing center for prisoners of war taken by the Germans during the war. The DULAG in Oberursel was an Air Force DULAG, a prison camp into which the Germans put American Air Force prisoners who were taken when a plane was shot down or they parachuted, or British Air Force officers were interrogated at a DULAG in Oberursel to determine what they knew. And if the Germans felt that their prisoners in a Gulag, a processing center, was very important, he was sent to a Stalag, S-T-A-L-A-G. That was a Stationslager, a permanent prisoner of war camp, to which they were then brought for detailed interrogation and also to work on German farms and to be a work crew stationed at a Stalag. Now the Gulag in Oberursel, we took over. We liberated all of the Americans and British who were there, and we put the Germans into their Gulag for further interrogation. So I was assigned to this MISC, which was the Military Intelligence Service Center, under General Eisenhower's command. And my job was to interrogate military officers who were not going to be interrogated at Nuremberg for a project known as the History of the German General Staff. So generals like Bötticher, Kesselring, Varlimont, and others who were members of the German General Staff but were not considered criminals of war and who are not going to be tried at Nuremberg. So after we transported the major criminals to Nuremberg, I was transferred to Oberursel to conduct, as a chief interrogator, to conduct a history of the German General Staff. In the course of that work, Robert Lai, the Labor Front leader who was at Nuremberg, wrote a letter to me telling me that he had some very important information which was of great value to the War Crimes Commission at Nuremberg. And if I would come to Nuremberg, he would give me that information. He would not give it to anyone else except to me, because I had won his confidence when I was the welfare officer at Luxembourg. Consequently, they tracked me down and they sent me to Nuremberg to get this important information from Robert Lai, the Labor Front leader. Now, I ended up in Nuremberg, thanks to Robert Lai, the Labor Front leader, to get this information from him. Colonel Andrews, who was the commanding officer of the prison, the detention center in Luxembourg, was now the head of the prison in Nuremberg. He wanted me to join him in Nuremberg. So once I arrived there to get the information from Lai, that Lai had, Colonel Andrews pulled the strings to keep me in Nuremberg, with the result that I ended up on permanent assignment to the Nuremberg trials. Otherwise, if it hadn't been for Lai writing me a letter, I would never have gotten to Nuremberg. So I never knew, at that time, I resented Lai managing to get me to Nuremberg. And I was foolish, because we were making history at Nuremberg, and I didn't know it. So I owe it all to Lai.
Did he really have important information?
I was unhappy. I didn't want to be at Nuremberg. I didn't want any more Nazis. I wanted to do work on my project in Oberursel about the German General Staff and go skiing in the Taunus Mountains and be very happy. But instead, Lai managed to get me to Nuremberg, which was devastated the town was bombed out. I mean, the living accommodations were very obnoxious for us, and I wanted nothing more to do with the Nazis. But now I had to be there. I became a deputy to Colonel Andrews, Burton C. Andrews, Andrus, who was the commandant of the prison. And who wants to be a deputy commandant of a prison? Intelligence work was no longer being conducted. We were finished with interrogation. We had completed our mission in Luxembourg. So there was no intelligence work to be done. However, once I got to Nuremberg, the prison psychiatrist was a Major Douglas Kelly, who was a psychiatrist from the University of California at Berkeley. And he had been assigned to be the prison psychiatrist. He couldn't speak German. So how are you going to give the ink blot test and a Rorschach analysis test to somebody who can't speak German? I mean, but how is somebody going to administer the test if he can't speak German? I majored in psychology at Miami University. The Army found that out, so Colonel Andrews assigned me to be the interpreter for Colonel, the prison psychiatrist. So now I went with Douglas Kelly to all the prisoners, and we gave them the Rorschach analysis test, the ink blot test. I was the interpreter. Kelly would ask a question. He'd present an ink, you're familiar with it, aren't you, the ink blot test? And he would show a picture to the prisoner and ask him, what do you see? What does this mean to you? But I would do the asking because he couldn't speak German. The prisoner would tell us what the ink blot looked like and why. And I would translate what the prisoner said into English for Major Kelly. On the basis of all of this, he was able to determine their IQ, quite a bit about their personality, and even it would reveal some things that they knew that they hadn't admitted before, that they had denied. The Rorschach test is very effective in psychoanalysis. And my major job then was to translate the analysis from English into German and German into English, unless the prisoner could speak English, like Goering, like Hess, Rudolf Hess, who had not been in Luxembourg, but came to us directly from England, where he had been a prisoner after his trip to his flight to Scotland. That's how I spent my time, until I got sick of it. I didn't want to do any more work in Nuremberg. So I pulled some strings too. And my commanding officer back in Oberursel, Colonel Philp, managed to outrank Colonel Andrews and got me transferred back to Oberursel. And I was rid of Nuremberg, except that I was still doing the history of the German General Staff. So I had to go back to Nuremberg occasionally to interrogate some of the general officers who were at Nuremberg. This gave me the opportunity to sit in some of the trials, particularly when Goering was being tried. Also, when Hess was being tried. As a spectator, I did my work, interrogated about the history of the German General Staff, And in my free time, which I could arrange, I was a spectator at the trials, sitting up there behind the press corps, and could observe what was going on, just for my own satisfaction. And I could do that over weekends, and go on back to Oberursel on Monday or Tuesday, and there finish my project on the German General Staff. And then I got tired of that too. I finished it. I didn't want to do any more talking to Nazis. So I persuaded Colonel Philp to give me a plush job. I became the motor pool officer. I got a brand new Jeep. And it had my son's name on the Jeep, Johnny Mike, and him was John Michael. Johnny Mike, the picture of the Jeep up here with Johnny Mike on it. It was a brand new Jeep, it had about 10 miles on it when I got it. And I drove all over Germany and Austria to visit motor pools and to gather motor parts and engines for our motor pool. I also did a lot of sightseeing. I managed to put well over 10,000 miles on that Jeep, traveling around Paris and Berlin and other places looking for motor pool parts. So I liked that job very much, till I got enough brownie points to come home. I came home in June of 1946, was discharged, and came back as a civilian. I gathered my wife, who had been in Akron all that time while I was in Europe, and we came back to Cincinnati. I got my job back at Procter & Gamble at Ivydale, and we built a house just down the road here from where we are now, on Banbury Street. We built a house, and we were all settled. I went back to my work at P&G, when a year later, not quite a year later, I found out that Miami University is looking for an alumni secretary. For the first time in the history of Miami University, that there would be a full-time alumni secretary who would organize class reunions, organize Miami alumni clubs all over the country, and of course, work in fundraising and development for Miami University. Live in Oxford. I thought that was just a great opportunity. So I quit my job at Procter & Gamble. We sold our house on Banbury Street, and I moved to Oxford, Ohio. First, I commuted for quite a while until we found a place to live. And I came to Oxford, back to Oxford as the Director of Alumni Affairs and Chief Development Officer. My job was fundraising, organizing alumni, and raising money for projects like the Art Museum, like Merstein Alumni Center, like the Conference Center, where Fisher Hall used to be, the Markham Conference Center, the Shriver Center, which at that time was called the Student Union. It became a university center and then became a Shriver Center. I worked at that job for 35 years, from 1947 until 1981. In 1967, in 1966, I was made Executive Director of Development and Alumni Affairs, Executive Director. And I became a member of President Shriver's cabinet. There were 4 of us on the cabinet. Lloyd Goggin, who was Vice President for Business Affairs. Charles Ray Wilson, who was Vice President for Academic Affairs. Robert Etheridge, who was executive director of student affairs, and I was executive director of alumni affairs. Until next year, the next year, 67, Etheridge and I became vice president for student affairs, and I became vice president for alumni and development affairs. We were 4 members of the president's cabinet, making university policy and helping to help Dr. Schreiber guide the university for the next 16 years, until 1981. In 1981, wait a minute, 1981, President Reagan, January 1981, President Reagan was inaugurated as President of the United States. Meanwhile, turning back the clock, in 1967, when I became vice president for development and university relations, all external relations of Miami University came under my jurisdiction. Ray Wilson was interested in international affairs. So he established an international studies program at Miami University as provost and vice president. In that program, he wanted to arrange for students to have a study year abroad. Consequently, he got together with a classmate of his from the class of 1926. Koichi Hasegawa was his name. Koichi Hasegawa was a professor of history at Waseda University in Tokyo. He was also a graduate of Miami University, class of 1926. And he came back to Oxford in 1926, 1966, for the 40th reunion of his class. And he was a good friend of Charles Ray Wilson's. He and Wilson got together and decided to establish an exchange program at Waseda University in Tokyo. Miami students could go to Japan, and Japanese students would come to Oxford. An exchange program, part of the International Studies program. It was all arranged. They exchanged, shook hands, and Dr. Hasegawa went back to Waseda University to start the program. He had a heart attack and died. So the program went down the tube. Now Ray Wilson came to me as the Chief Development Officer and said, where can we go in Europe to have an international studies program? I said, Luxembourg, my native country. There's no university in Luxembourg. And I think Luxembourg would be very happy to have a branch of Miami University, campus of Miami University in Luxembourg. So I went to Luxembourg to explore the possibility. And I took with me an alumni tour made up mostly of members of the Board of Trustees of Miami University. We met with the American ambassador to Luxembourg, who was representing the United States in Luxembourg. Her name is Patricia Roberts Harris. She was the ambassador. African American. I met with her, talked with her on our alumni tour. She was very excited. I talked with the Minister of Education in Luxembourg, who was a schoolmate of mine when I went to school in Luxembourg. And I talked to the president of the American Luxembourg Society, who was a doctor, medical doctor, and a Luxembourger, spoke English fluently, and was president of the American Luxembourg Society. This was somebody you probably met when you were a student in Luxembourg. Carla Putz, P-U-T-Z. Dr. Putz and his wife, who was also a doctor, a psychologist, always came to Miami functions. He had a slight limp, you might recognize him from that. Carla Putz and his wife, Mrs. Dr. Putz, were active in the Luxembourg American program and agreed to have the Luxembourg American Society that society provide housing for students from Miami University who would come to Luxembourg, because they had the contacts with the Luxembourgers who were members of the Luxembourg American Society. Well, I talked to all these people. They were all very excited. So we had a black tie dinner at the Cons Hotel, right on the Gare, the railroad station. And we invited the Minister of Education, and we invited Dr. Putz and other Luxembourgers, and we invited the American ambassador. And I gave a talk about Miami University, how great it was. And members of the Board of Trustees had a chance to talk to these Luxembourgers. So when we came back, it was decided. Members of the Board of Trustees recommended that we establish a Miami University branch in Luxembourg. But there was a lot of objection. French department in Oxford objected because they didn't think that they spoke proper French in Luxembourg. The German department objected because they didn't think the Luxembourgers would welcome Germans to Luxembourg and the language problem.
Excuse me.
The German department didn't think they speak proper German in Luxembourg, so they weren't too enthusiastic about coming to Luxembourg. This is the academic department. And then, of course, the geography department objected. Luxembourg was so small they couldn't find it on a map. I'd like to pull their legs on that. Anyhow, the point is, whenever you introduce a new program in academics, you get a lot of opposition. The people who don't benefit from that program aren't in favor of it. The physics department, the chemistry department, geology department say, well, we'll never get a chance to go over there, so why would we be interested in it? It wasn't just Luxembourg, it was anywhere. They just weren't interested in international study programs. So we had to do a lot of promoting and propagandizing. The net result of it was that a committee was appointed. I was a member of the committee, and the committee was to go overseas and see what other country might be interested in. So a committee of 4 went to Austria, and we checked out Salzburg, which would have been a nice place, but they weren't interested. We went to Aix-en-Provence in France, and to Lille in France, and they weren't interested. They already had a lot of other programs. We went to Copenhagen and to Brussels, and a couple of places, in Bonn in Germany, well, nobody, or Trier rather, in Germany, and they weren't interested. But Luxembourg was. The government, from the Grand Duke on down, was very supportive of the idea of having a branch of an American university in Luxembourg. With the net result that it was finally decided, go. And that same study committee then would meet once a week during 1967 and 1968 to plan the curriculum and get everything in shape to make the arrangements. And officially, Miami University inaugurated the Miami University Center in the fall of 1968, which was 35 years ago. And we're now celebrating the 35th anniversary of the Miami University Center. 5 years ago, we were very fortunate to, just 5 years ago, very fortunate to have Arbed, the very important steel company in Luxembourg, make available to us a medieval castle in Differdange. And for the last 5 years, we've been in a genuine 11th century or 12th century castle. So our students eat 5 meals a week in the castle. They attend all their courses. We have the library and an auditorium, and all the facilities is absolutely perfect. The director, Dr. Stiller, and his wife live in the castle. They're the chatelaine, as we call them. And we hope we'll be there for many more years. We hope to go, my wife and I hope to go over and celebrate the 35th anniversary in October, on October 15th to be exact. So that was, I consider that one of the most important achievements of my academic career. It was sort of the capstone to all of the other successful projects that the alumni of Miami University made possible over the years. Miami University felt that way too, so 5 years ago in 1988, when we celebrated 1988, I'm sorry, when we celebrated the 20th anniversary, the Board of Trustees voted to name the center the Miami University Dolibois European Center. So it's MUDEC, M-U-D-E-C, Miami University Dolibois European Center. So to have my name on a medieval castle sort of completes a pattern of circles. Having been born in Luxembourg, down in the valley, the Petrus Valley, living there, and now having a castle named for me is quite an achievement. I'm very happy with that. Okay, so much for the Miami University Center. It has been a successful venture, and we have now more than 4,000 alumni of Miami University who have had a semester or study abroad at the center. So that's something to point to with a lot of satisfaction and pride. In 1981, I decided that I would be completing 35 years at Miami University, and it was time to retire. So with that in mind, my wife and I planned a trip to Europe to celebrate our retirement and make plans for the future. Ronald Reagan had been elected president, was inaugurated in 1981, and before his election, about a week before his election in 1980, I remember listening to a campaign talk of his on television, in which he said if he were elected president, he would appoint a diplomatic corps whose members could speak the language and knew the country and the culture and the people of the country they were going to serve. About 5 minutes after that speech, the telephone rang, and Congressman Bud Brown from Urbana, Ohio, who was a personal friend of mine, was on the line and said, "Did you hear Reagan's speech?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, he was talking about you." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, you're the only person I know who can speak Luxembourgish and also knows the people of Luxembourg and has connections through Miami University in Luxembourg. I think you ought to be ambassador to Luxembourg." I laughed and I said, "Well, you know, political appointees are appointed because they made a big contribution to campaign and also to the election of the president. And I've never made a big contribution. I've never been involved in politics. I think you got the wrong guy. I don't think that I would qualify. I said, let's call Reagan's bluff. Let's put your name in, put your hat in a ring and see if he really means it. So I laughed again. I said, be my guest. I'm going to retire anyway, so if something like that would have materialized, I'd be available. That was the end of it. Well, Bud Brown was very serious. He got the names of some members of Beta Theta Pi, of which I'm a member, and in which I had been active as an alumnus. I'd been scholarship commissioner and district chief, and I got to know quite a few Betas who were also in Congress. I had also served during my vice presidency at Miami University as a member of the Board of Foreign Scholarships, which administers the Fulbright program. I served 8 years on the Fulbright board and got to know quite a few members of the House of Representatives and also members in Congress and Senate. For instance, Richard Lugar, who at that particular time was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and is also a fraternity brother of mine. I had spoken at Denison University at the initiation banquet of Richard Lugar when he was a student and a member of Beta Theta Pi at Denison. He was now a senator from Indiana and chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the subcommittee for Europe. John Warner was a member of the Senate, Senator Warner. Jim Martin in the House. There were others who knew of me or whom I had met. And Congressman Brown contacted all of them. And they all started recommending me to President Reagan. Meanwhile, we went off to Europe, made a tour of Europe. My wife and I, with another couple, a state senator, Barry Levy from Middletown, who had also been a member of the Board of Trustees of Miami University. There were some prominent alumni of Miami University. President of Cintas, for instance, Dick Farmer, and some vice presidents of IBM, vice president of IBM, and others who were active in Miami's alumni program through my efforts, and also very prominent in business and management in the United States. They all recommended me. Meanwhile, my wife and I went off to Italy. We were in Venice, shopping, when a message came through. The concierge of our hotel told me that I had a very important massaggio to call the President of the United States at the White House in Washington. Well, that was important. And we had been out sightseeing when I came back to the hotel. I immediately got to the phone, called the operator of the hotel, and she came on the line and said, "Prego, what can I do for you?" And I said, "I would like to speak to the President of the United States in Washington." And she laughed, said, "So would I," and hung up. I had to go back downstairs and tell the concierge and the operator that this was a serious call. So they placed the call again. So we waited, opened up a bottle of champagne, and the President of the United States came on the line. First, a woman's voice, the secretary, who said, "Are you John Dolibois in room 32 of the Palace, or the Goody Palace Hotel in Venice?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "Just a moment, the President of the United States." And Ronald Reagan came on the line. And I was a little bit nervous, shaking. I had never talked to a president before. Ronald Reagan said, "Well," first word he spoke, "Well, what time is it over there?" And I said, "The President of the United States calling me to find out what time it is in Italy." I told him, well, Mr. President, it's 8 o'clock. And he said, well, that's good, because I called somebody in Australia yesterday, got him out of bed at 4 o'clock in the morning. I didn't want to do that to you. So I said, no, it's 8 o'clock, Mr. President, we're just going out to dinner, Harry's Bar. And he said, well, I wish I could join you, but unfortunately, I can't. I hope you don't like Italy too much, because I have another place in mind for you. And I said, well, Mr. President, make me an offer I can't refuse. And he said, see, you've been in Italy too long already. You talk like the Godfather. By then we were good friends. You know, the master communicator had put me at ease. And he said, I'd like to have you be my ambassador to Luxembourg. So it took me about 5 seconds to make up my mind. And told him how great an honor that would be. And the deal was made. And then I said, Mr. President, you should know that exactly 50 years ago today, June 2nd, 1931, my father and I left Luxembourg to come to the United States as immigrants. And Ronald Reagan said, I know that. That's why I waited until today to call you. You know, I had to get a lump in my throat. And I decided I had to be the best ambassador to Luxembourg that President Reagan could possibly appoint. So that's the deal. And I agreed. We made a little small talk, and that was it. Now things really got exciting, because I was now a future ambassador. And for the rest of our trip, that was on my mind, that I'd be coming back as an ambassador of the United States to Europe, and have the opportunity to visit all these places that we were exploring now. And it was rather exciting. Then there was the attempted assassination. John W. Hinckley shot at President Reagan. So things came to a halting stand. We waited. There was a long silent period. Fortunately,